Hello, this is Dr. Alan Yim. I'm going to show you how to use figure-based symbols and what they mean. So, figure-based symbols were used in the Baroque period really as a means of shorthand for composers and for the musicians. So, the figured part of it, you could kind of think of it figures as numbers. Sometimes you use that word numbered bass symbol. Okay, figured bass. It's like the numbered bass. So what does that mean? Well, in the last video I mentioned that these are shorthand for different kinds of triads and seventh chords. And this is not the way they were originally viewed, but well, it's become the way we use it for music theory and for analysis. So root position, first, second, and third inversion, you may remember we use these symbols 6, 6, 4, and of course nothing for the triad because if you invert it one more time it goes back to root position. 7th, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, and third inversion for the 7th is 4, 2. Okay, now let's take a look at the bass. So what did the bass player have? Well, the bass player, of course, had a bass line. And let's just pretend we're in the key of C, and let's suppose it went something like this. Okay, so something quite simple. And maybe like this. Alright. Normally, we're going to discover most of the chords that were written in terms of something like this would just be the chord given by the bass, as if the bass was in root position. So if you don't see anything down below the bass note, it's just that is the chord. It's a triad, it's just a root position triad. So these first three chords might be C, G, and F. Of course, this is the bass. Interesting, I probably... So... unlikely chord progression, but in any case, that is a possibility. Now, what about this? Well, remember, we know that if it's in first inversion, what part's in the bass? The third of the chord. So you can go back and review this. If it's in first inversion, the third's in the bass. If it's second inversion, it's the fifth. And if it's in third inversion, it's the seventh. So that means that the root of this chord is a third below, which is C. And in the next video, I will show you how we write these chord symbols, but basically it's a C chord over that E. So instead of it being a root position chord, that 6 indicates that it's in first inversion. Okay, it sounds a little bit different. It's still a C chord, but it's a C with the E in the bass. Now, here's where the interesting thing comes in. I just want you to understand what these figures meant to the Baroque player. This figured bass wasn't just played by the bass player. It was played by a chord instrument as well. So that could be a keyboard player, it could be a lute, something that could play chords. It could be a harpsichord. So what they were actually looking at, in modern notation, we think, okay, that chord is a C chord with an E in the bass. But to the Baroque player, these were intervals above the bass. So they played a sixth above the bass, and then there's a 3 that you don't see. So there are some symbols that they just understood they were there, but when they saw the 6, it meant to play that chord, a C chord. And those numbers were actually indications of intervals above the bass. So I'll give you one more example, a 7th chord, and then I will let you figure out, you could do this on your own. You could write a 7th chord according to the figure bass, and you could look at it in the music. Okay, suppose you got something like this, 4, 3, and you know this is a 7th chord. You remember that this is second inversion from that chart that we saw. Second inversion, which means that this is the fifth of the chord. So to find the root, now you're realizing maybe why this is important. The root is down a fifth. So the root is a G. So it's going to be like this. This is the fifth of the chord. So the chord looks something like this in reality, right? It's the fifth, and it's G over D. It's some kind of seventh chord. G over D. And, well, if I don't put any accidentals, that actually is the chord. But notice now we have a 4 and a 3. How does that work? Well, we know there's two notes that we must play in this chord. A fourth above that D, which is G, actually the root, and the third above that chord, which is an F. That looks bad. I'm going to rewrite that so that the third is above like this. And I'm going to make like I did before, I'm going to make the root stick out. So those notes we have to have. And actually, there's one more note that's not in the figure bass. It's the B. Okay, so that's the full chord. This one here, notice what interval we're leaving out. We're omitting 6. So if I were to put all of the parts, it would look like this, 6, 4, 3. And maybe you could just guess, and maybe I'll take a guess, why they decided to leave the 6 out. Well, you know, it looks a lot like 6, 4, so that's confusing. 4, 3 is actually not ambiguous. You see 4, 3, you know that you're supposed to play a 7th chord, or at least play that 4th and 3rd above the D, right? You really need the B as well. Okay, so that's the full chord there, kind of spread out. But it's a D in the bass, I have a B, an F, and a G. So that's a G7 over D. Okay, last thing, well, no, I think this is about it for figured bass. I just want you to understand that, again, this was something to allow the keyboard player, or whoever was playing the chords, to improvise. Their part actually was not written out at all. And they would basically just read the chords, and like a good jazz player, you know, they did the baroque equivalent of comping, and they would perhaps improvise once in a while in response to what was going on in the rest of the music. Alright, that's it for this video. I hope it's clear, and if you have any questions, please let me know.